Okay, let's get started if we can. Let's get started. Hope you're all doing well. Lots to cover today. I want to get started with letting you know where we are in the class and giving you an opportunity, if you need it, to ask me some questions about the exam. So just to be clear, there are you're graded on three things this quarter in my class. One is the midterm, which will be a week from today. One will be the paper, which is due Thursday of week 6. And then there's a final exam, a non-cumulative final exam that will be held on the last day of class in week 10. Okay, so graded on three things and three things only. The exam itself will consist of 50 questions. Each question will have 5 options for it. And do you have any general questions, just so you're not wasting a lot of time studying unimportant things? Keep in mind, no trick questions. I don't want you to hate me. That's not my thing. I don't do the trick questions. But it's not going to be easy. I'm not just going to lob a bunch of softballs at you. So, but there are no trick questions. And if you've been following along during class, usually 2, maybe 3 times a class, I'll say, you should know that. I reviewed the exam this weekend. Everything I said, you should know. Okay? You should know those things. That'll give you close to 20 of the questions, right? That'll get you really close to 20, maybe even half of the questions on the exam. Start there. Start with those as topics, because something very close to the slide that I showed you, and you'll see probably 3 examples of that today as well. Something very close to that will appear on the exam, okay? From there, then your job is to go into the chapters and say, of all the other 25 questions, the other 30 questions that I could expect to see on the exam, what do I think he could ask? Like, what would be a reasonable, legitimate question to ask about the material in a chapter? So go into a chapter and say, oh, here's 10 good questions he could ask. Here's 12 questions I can imagine him asking. And the more you can sort of focus in, separate out incidental detail from stuff that really seems chunky and important, the more you can do that, the more you'll identify, let's say, 10 questions for each of 7 chapters, right? So if you've gone along and you've looked at the outlines, etc., you'll have 50 or 70 things that you need to know. And then you're pretty close to knowing what the whole exam is going to be about, right? So that's my idea for how to study. But I also want to answer any questions just to get you oriented so you're not wasting your time.
Will you be providing a practice midterm?
I will probably circulate some practice questions. And it's not so much that the questions matter or the answers matter, because the question was, will I circulate some practice questions? And the answer is yes. But the important idea is not that those questions matter, but you get a sense for how I ask questions, the level of detail, the level of specificity. By the way, you'll look at that document and you will freak out, because you'll say, well, I don't remember any of that stuff. That's because it probably existed in another version of the class that you don't need to worry about. The idea is that's sort of the level of specificity. Good question. I'll try to get that out to you in the next couple days. Yeah? The questions, there are chapter quizzes, strictly optional. Those chapter quizzes, that's just for your own, really for your own recreation and amusement. The questions that I ask, I don't think are that much like that. They're not terribly dissimilar, but what the quizzes help you do is to see which terms matter. There's a lot of value in seeing those terms. And I think in terms of the types of questions that I'm going to ask, I would look a little more closely at the questions that I'll circulate. There will also be a note in that document that I circulate that I encourage you to read closely. It basically elaborates what I just said. Good question, though. Other questions? There is 1 or 2 questions. There are 1 or 2 questions on the videos, okay? The assigned videos that are on my YouTube page. Take a look at those. If you are paying attention during the video, they're 8 minutes long, you'll get those questions right. Right? Those aren't like amazingly complicated questions. Those are simple questions. There are other questions about videotapes that I've shown in class, but a lot of it isn't about like the intricacies of Frank and Nadine's relationship as much as it is the point of me showing that, right? What was the point? What was the point of me showing that clip from the Sideways movie? Like, what was the point? I'm not going to ask you for really specific details about those interactions, but ask yourself, whenever you see, whenever you look at your notes as you're going through the lectures and you see a video clip in there, say, what was the point of showing that video? Like, what was the idea? Not so much the detail of the video itself, but why would that tell us something interesting? And, you know, for the Sideways video, it had a lot to do with, you know, that the power of disclosure and how people respond to disclosure as a way of deepening, or not, in the case of Miles, as we saw, how that relationship moves forward, right? So you see the difference. There's an idea there, and try to work your way back to the general idea, yeah.
I know in the syllabus, I think it mentioned that you might have a study guide. Is that the questions you're circulating, or will you give us like a list of terms that we can kind of use to quiz ourselves? Like, oh, do I know this? Can I expand on this?
The question is, will I be giving you a study guide? There are study guides attached to each chapter on the course website. So those outlines are actually pretty good. So focus on those. My questions will, the study guide, the questions that I circulate, the exam, the practice questions, will give you more a sense of how I ask the questions. Also, I want to, later today, maybe tomorrow, when we get this all worked out, Emily and I will be circulating our office hours for the upcoming week. One of the things I'm going to try to do, which I haven't done so much in the past, but I think you might value more, is rather than doubling up on my office hours, I'll probably add some office hours, I'll be online for a specific amount of time, okay? So if you need to check in with me, is that a better way to do it so you don't need to like schlep all the way over to my office, like you can just send me an email? Is that something you're willing to do? Okay, so let's do that. I'll do both. It's not like it's one or the other, but more so than in the past, I'll really try to create some online office hours, especially so you can have a little access to me over the weekend and especially on Monday as you really gather steam and get your questions answered. Other questions, I'm happy to really try to help you as best I can without giving away stuff. I'll get you in a sec. You don't need to know the names of theorists, right? That's not something you need to know. In fact, they are given in the response to one of the questions about the theories. Question here?
Are the graphs and research findings throughout the book, are those imperative to know, or more the ones that you highlighted in the lecture slides?
So the question is, how about the research findings in the book? Here's a good way to think about that. If it appeared in the lecture, there is a really good chance it'll appear on the exam. If it appears in the book, there's much less of a chance, because what I try to do is pull out the findings in my lecture from the book that I think are going to be most important. That doesn't mean that some research findings in the book won't be on the exam, though. So part of your job, as I was saying earlier, is to try to sort through things and say, oh, for this figure in the book, which wasn't in the lecture, what would a reasonable question about that figure be? Like, how might I be quizzed on that? So that's a way to think about it. So the challenge is to say, and you know, it's reasonable to infer, and there aren't too many instances of this in the book, that if I create a figure for something in the book, it's kind of important. Yeah. I will provide Scantrons, is that right, Emily? We'll have Scantrons. Bring a pencil, though. Yeah.
One more question, please. So the outlines, are those ones are more like concentrated on the important material that are dissected from each chapter?
Yeah, the outlines on the class website do sort of summarize the gist of things. And what I think they help you do is, instead of seeing all those pages in a book, they help you to see all in one place, even on one page, what the main key transition points were in the chapter, right? So
like the emphasis, like what we should be focusing on from each chapter?
They help you to organize the stuff in each chapter. But Questions will not be limited to just those outlines.
Oh, okay.
Okay, good question. Other questions like that? All right, I think we have sorry, I'll get you in a sec. I think we have like a community email. Isn't that what that's called? I think we have like an online something. What's it called? Discussion forum, discussion board. Use that as much as you want. I get triggered every time one question shows up there. And then I think everybody who wants to can see that. So do that. That's probably best. But if you want to just email me directly, that's fine. Try not to ask questions like, could you reread pages 23 to 24 for me? Like that, those are hard for me to respond. I can serve you best when you ask questions that allow me to say, think about this part, or that won't be on the exam, don't worry about it, or this is the kind of thing you should be saying. So, try to use me in a way that gives you very quick, succinct answers to your questions, okay? Yeah?
I was just going to ask, you wouldn't be so general as to say, in my 2010 experiment on happiness in couples, what were my findings?
No, it's pretty clear, right? And in fact, in many cases, not many cases, I will ask questions from the book and say, here's a hint, it's from this part of the chapter. When I was talking about this in this specific lecture, what was, when I was looking at this in relation to this, what was the main finding? So I'm trying to bring you right up to the brink and get you to answer it. Like I don't need to make enemies. I just want to quiz you without having you dislike me. And there's a fine line there. Other questions? Oh. Yes.
Will the review sessions be podcasted?
The review sessions, will those be podcasted? Probably not. Probably not. I think we're going to announce the review sessions. Do we have rooms yet? Not yet. We're trying to get those. They won't be podcast. The key thing about review sessions is that Emily will be pulling out those slides from the lectures especially that I said focus on those slides. She will also be available to answer questions about the book, but won't be sort of giving you a full-blown summary of the book. So come prepared with questions, I think is the best way to think about that. But we'll get that out to you as soon as we know. We have to schedule a room, and that slows us down, unfortunately. Other questions? Thanks for that point about review sessions. So we'll get those out as soon as we can. All right, so that's where we are. I'm happy to keep answering questions. I'm also around for a few minutes after class today. Just, I know sometimes when you look at a large body of material, if someone can say, don't worry too much about that, worry a lot about that, that can focus your efforts. And the key thing is really start with the lectures. Like really sort of know that there's going to be 20 plus questions from the lecture, and then your job is to go back into the book and see what else is worthy of questions. Okay, so we have 2 more lectures before the exam, and I will sort of flag things as we go so that it's really clear what I want you to extract. And at this point, we are in the second half of Chapter 6. And the question that we're grappling with is, what are the ways in which people vary and differ among themselves, differ amongst all of us? How do we vary in ways that matter in the management and course of our intimate relationships, right? So remember, our critical question is, why do some relationships thrive and others falter, right? And we're entertaining the idea that one of the reasons they thrive and falter is something about the people themselves and where they've been prior to the relationship that they're now forming, okay? We talked about one explanation for that was a trait-based model, right? And we talked about the power of negative emotionality and self-esteem, the dependency regulation model. You're going to see an example of that on the exam, and you're going to have to sort of know that. And then we talked about the effects, what families afford for us when we're developing. And we talked in particular about what happens when families break down and change, and the effects that that has on children. You will need to know the results of the Cherlin study that I talked about in our last class. You'll need to know that glass half empty, glass half full kind of idea. You'll need to know about the different ways that experiences from last lecture in childhood connect up with our current experiences. Remember, right at the end of our last class, I gave a list of different ways that our relationships when we're growing up seem to carry through, seem to connect up with the way that we even act. We can even, I showed you an observational study linking behaviors in a videotaped task to people with different kinds of backgrounds, right? So you're going to need to know those kinds of things for the exam. In fact, you're going to need to know those specific things. Today we elaborate on that discussion, not in a fundamentally new way, but in a different way. And that is all around the idea of attachment. Okay, so if there's a big title for today's lecture, it's attachment. And attachment, when we think about this, and I know you relate this to John Bowlby. We talked about that in the third lecture, right, when we were talking about theoretical perspectives on relationships. What we gain when we think about attachment theory in a very hard way, when we really focus on attachment theory, we get an answer to these questions. Why do we form relationships to begin with? And how do our prior relationships affect the quality and duration of a given romantic relationship? So we talked about this loosely from the point of view of what our families provide for us and how changes in our families might change who we are when we go into relationships. Now we're going to dive in even a little more deeply and talk about how, in particular, our caregivers treat us. Okay? So attachment refers to an emotional bond that one individual forms with another individual who can provide protection, comfort, and support. A secure base, an important idea, a term that you will see on the exam. A secure base from which to explore, and a safe haven when threatened. Okay, and usually, Bowlby was more of a child psychiatrist. Usually we think of this in the context of parent-child relationships. That's where this idea began. Okay? The idea was that within that baby, there is being created an orientation toward relationships and the world. And for that child to survive, they have to coordinate a number of different tasks and responsibilities. And I'll get to those, not responsibilities, a number of tasks and challenges. And I'll get to those in a minute. But the idea is that our relationships, this attachment bond that we create, gives us protection, comfort, gives us a place to launch out into the world knowing that we've got a secure base behind us somewhere. And also when we go out into the world and it becomes threatening, we've got protection to go back to. Very powerful experience. This is an idea that actually grew out of ethology and the study of human behavior. That is Konrad Lorenz right there. You know that attachment theory is already associated with John Bowlby, passed away in 1990. He was very influenced by Konrad Lorenz, an ethologist. You see him there on the left. You probably remember him from your introduction to psychology classes, with the idea being that built into those geese, built into those ducks, whatever they are, is an imprinting system. The idea that the first moving organism that those creatures see when they come out of the egg, they imprint on and they follow, and because there is some internal wiring that allows them to say, this is where comfort comes from, this is where food comes from, this is where security comes from. The funny part, of course, is that it's just an old guy in boots instead of the actual mother. But in nature, usually, it's the mother itself. And so Bowlby built directly off of this idea and said, importantly, that a child's first relationship is the foundation stone of his personality. So remember, we talked about the trait model in our last class, the beginning of our last class. And that, Lewis Terman, you remember that guy, and questionnaires, and the idea that people have a predisposition to unhappiness. Well, Bowlby is saying that there is another way of thinking about it, not just from a tell me about yourself. What are your personality traits? Tell me about how powerful negative affectivity is as a dimension in your life. But he's saying that our relationships, when we're growing up, that's the source, that's the wellspring of the personality that we then go on to create and exist in, and then that we bring into our relationships later in life. Now, it's a question you will see on the exam. There are two ways of thinking about attachment. Okay? One answers that first question that I outlined, which is, why are we in relationships? What's that all about? Right, that's the first dimension. The second dimension, which I'll elaborate on in a minute, is more the idea of how does that work uniquely for any of us? So there's a general idea that we're all sort of like the ducks, right? That we all sort of imprint on a caregiver. That's the general idea. It's just a principle by which we're believed to develop our personalities. But then there's the idea that each of us develops a different personality, right? And the manner in which that happens is believed to be determined by the caregiver's response to us. Okay, so we'll get to that second part in a minute. First, I want you to get this universal idea fixed in your heads, okay? This idea that this is the way it works, according to attachment theory. And they use this term, the attachment behavioral system. And this is a developing capacity within a child, a baby, an infant, that orients the infant to the caregiver, just like the duck, and helps to ensure that infant's survival. And what the infant is really monitoring is a sense of upset, right? Their own emotional well-being in a very crude sense, right? A very sort of basic way that an infant would say good, bad, happy, unhappy, something very crude, right? The availability of a caregiver and threats in the environment. So those are the three things that this universal system does for you. That's not too hard to understand, right? That there's a threatening world, potentially. There's a secure place that I go to when I am threatened. And I have the ability as a 3-month-old infant to know how I'm feeling, respond to threat, and then sort of return to my caregiver, right? Basic, core, dynamic system that helps the infant to survive. Without it, most of us would be out of luck. If felt security, so this capacity that the infant has to register content versus discontent in that crude way, like good, bad, like I'm okay, I'm not okay, right? If that's threatened, then the infant tries to get back to the caregiver. No surprise. And if that's possible, the infant jumps back to the caregiver and looks around, like make sure everything's okay. And if it's not possible, the infant freezes, right? So that they are not really going to be prey to any larger organism in the outside world, okay? And so one strategy is jump back in, get connected, get soothed, make sure everything's going to stay that way, and whatever that threat is in the world out there, that it's not going to threaten me because I've got a caregiver. The other strategy is a difficult one to contemplate, which is the child doesn't have someone to go back to and deactivates, shuts down emotionally, right? I was once working with a client, and she vividly described for me a situation where when she was quite young, by her report, I mean she was an adult when I was speaking with her, she remembers a situation where when she was very, very young, in fact I think she said it was one of her earliest memories, she said, I still remember waking up in my crib and screaming at the top of my lungs for a long time for my mother. And she was next door. My mom put me down for a nap. And for whatever reason, I woke up. And she screamed and screamed and eventually just stopped and said, shit, sorry. By the way, 2-year-olds usually don't say that. Professors sometimes do. And said, I'm how do you make sense of that when you don't have the cognitive capacity to do that? You sort of say, I need to shut down, right? I need to not make much noise here because I don't know what's going to happen, right? So that's that idea that if you do get to a caregiver, everything's cool, you start to regulate your emotions, you start to connect up with a person who can soothe you. But if that's not an option for you, you shut down emotionally, you turn to yourself to give yourself the resources you need to get back to some emotional baseline, right? Did I get everything done? Yeah. So here's a nice picture. I love this picture. Here's a quote from Bowlby, one of his famous quotes. All of us, from cradle to the grave, are happiest when life is organized as a series of excursions, long or short, from the secure base provided by our attachment figures. So happiness is when we go out into the world, we discover things, we learn which boundaries not to cross, and we bring those back to a caregiver, right? And we sort of reconnect with another person. So the idea of a good relationship is not just that you're in the relationship, according to Bowlby, but that you really go out, explore the world, and come back. A good relationship helps you to become more than what you ordinarily would have been without that relationship. And you can see this baby so relaxed, right, in front of this photographer. This is a baby of one of my grad students. And what I love about this picture is that you see my student's left arm, her arm there on the left side, holding up the baby. So allowing the baby to have this great, wonderful, fun experience and sort of receding into the background. But the minute the baby starts to slip or something bad starts to happen, the mom jumps in, right? So this is the opportunity to really check out and have fun, but also know that you have support. And you can see how relaxed the baby's face is here. Okay, that's the first model. Okay, that when someone says attachment theory to you, I want you to have the idea in your head that, oh, right, there's two ways of thinking about that. One way is the universal way, all of that stuff that I just mentioned, the idea being that it applies to all of us. Now I want to get at this idea that it applies to each of us in different ways, depending on what our unique circumstances were when we were growing up, okay? So now we think of this as the individual differences. Not how is it that we're all the same in this respect, but how is it that we might be different in this respect, right? So, early experiences, as I've said, are the basis for working models of relationships, okay? So I want you to know that term secure base. It's intuitively obvious, right? The secure base is the caregiver. But there's this idea of working models that I also want you to get a hold of. It's not as obvious on the face of it, but I think when you hear the description, it'll be clear. A working model is just that idea that inside of us, as a result of our interactions with a caregiver, we create psychological structures that enable us to navigate the world. Okay? Working models. In my head, I have a model of myself, and I have a model of other people. Okay? That's the idea. And these working models are how those two things, or said another way, how that relationship gets managed. Okay? So, caregivers differ in responsiveness. That's a key idea in attachment theory. Once we go down this pathway of the individual differences model, individual differences are generated, the idea is, by what our caregiver does for us, right? And so if the caregiver is inconsistent or unavailable, that's going to produce anxiety, right? So sometimes when I turn to my caregiver, they're there and they're warm and they're comforting. Sometimes when I turn to my caregiver, they're not there or they're rejecting, right? So that's going to produce some anxiety, sensitivity to rejection, a low sense of self-worth, and feelings of inadequacy, right? So you can start to see the connection here between attachment theory and the dependency regulation idea, right? Which was that low sense of self-esteem that I then project out into the world, and then I assume everybody thinks the same of me that they think of me, and then I respond to them. and I say, how dare you think so little of me, when in fact that was me putting that on them. So you can start to see with this first point, where that yellow bullet is, a connection back over to dependency regulation. That's not on the exam, by the way. But it's true, and it's interesting. So that is the self-doubt idea, right? That is, there's something about my relationship with this other person that creates, within my working model, a sense of myself, right? And when it doesn't go so well, I have to wonder about, am I somehow not worthy of the affection of people who really should be in the business of taking really good care of me? Again, we're still in the childhood, infancy kind of game here, right? But then there's another dimension to our working model that tells us something about other people, right? Part of what, according to attachment theory, part of what we're doing is we're drawing conclusions about ourselves and about who's going to take care of ourselves, right? And so the first one is anxiety, and that's a self-related dimension. Okay? That word is really important in attachment theory. Anxiety. Self-relevant emotion. Okay? Avoidance is me in relation to somebody else. It's other-oriented. You are absolutely going to need to know the difference between anxiety and avoidance. Like, there is a question specifically on that on the exam. Okay? So you want to know that these working models are about what's going on inside of me and how I make conclusions about my worthiness, and what's going on with other people and the conclusions I draw about their availability to me. Okay, so here's what I say. Restoring proximity. So if I'm threatening the environment, I come back to that secure base, and I restore proximity with a punitive or a rejecting caregiver. It leads me to conclude possibly that I'm not worthy of that attention, but it also leads me to conclude that others are best avoided or unreliable. Okay? There's sort of an unreliability of other people, and I might need to develop strategies, emotion regulation strategies on my own that help me to not have to deal with other people so much because I can't trust them, right? So, two big things I've told you. The universal model and the individual differences model, big idea in attachment theory. And now the idea that when we are in the individual differences pathway, when we're thinking about it in that way, there are these working models, and these working models are really assumed to be organized around my understanding, the conclusions that I'm drawing about myself as a worthy individual, and the conclusions I'm drawing about another person and their ability to provide me with the caring and the nurturance that I am effectively designed to need and benefit from. Okay? So, now we take a step beyond Bowlby. Okay? And we start to say, okay, well, that doesn't just stop when you graduate from high school, right? That doesn't just stop as you go into adulthood. Those experiences may become muted. Those experiences may become difficult to remember sometimes. Those experiences may recede into the background of our memories. And yet, according to attachment theory, the idea is that the working models that were formed from 0 to whatever age and then stabilize some as a result of probably the stability of your caregiving environment, that those working models are still working. They're still operating. And this is in part what you have when you enter the dating market. This is in part what you have when you're looking at other prospective mates. Okay? It's this capacity to have a sense of who you are, have a sense of what other people can afford for you, provide for you, a sort of an expectation. One good way of thinking of working models is sort of an expectation. Like, what do you expect? Based on prior experiences, what do you expect in your new experiences? What do you think a new partner is likely to do for you? And what are you likely to do for that person, right? So now we extend attachment theory and the ideas of John Bowlby into adulthood. And let's talk about how that is going to go. In 1987, Cindy Hazan, a psychologist at Cornell University, and Phil Shaver, a psychologist, social psychologist at UC Davis, now retired, recognized that there are similarities between the relationships that we form in childhood with a caregiver and the relationships that we then form in adulthood. It's kind of interesting, huh? So the idea is that we evolve and grow more complex as human beings when we move from a family of origin, where we grew up, to what's sometimes called, mistakenly, I think, a family of procreation. The relationship where basically you're sort of moving and developing in adulthood. Okay? So now we're saying, oh, that's a switch, that's a shift, right? But what part of the bridge that connects those relationships is the working models that we formed when we were younger. So here was the insight that Hazan and Shaver made, which is that regardless of whether you're talking about infant-parent relationships or intimate relationships, close relationships as you move into adulthood, we feel safe when we're with another person, right? We like being physically with another person. There's something comforting to that. We like close bodily contact in both kinds of relationships, right? When we're on campus and we see people holding hands or snuggling or touching, that's a signal that that matters, right? You could imagine a world where that didn't happen. It's kind of hard to imagine. But part of what matters in our relationships is that the sense of physical touch. Like, we want to know that somebody's nearby. We want to know that someone's close to us. It's true when we were younger. It's true now when we're older, right? That's valuable. It's intrinsically valuable. So obvious that we don't even pause to think about that as, wow, that doesn't need to go that way, and yet it does almost all the time. In infant-parent relationships, if you watch videotapes of moms interacting with their kids, the moms are just locked onto kids, as are the dads, right? And the kids are locked onto the parents, right? There's just something really engaging. Like when you see parent-child engagement, that is a really powerful psychological moment where there's some deep connection, some deep sense that these two people are operating as one and their interests are deeply connected. And remnants of that exist in the relationships that you form. You probably really like being connected with your partner. You probably really like talking with them about important things, right? There are connections that we form that help us to feel, that help to activate those working models that let us say, wow, this feels good. This is what I want. People share discoveries with one another. So when you're away from your partner, when you go away from your secure base that is your partner, you come back and you talk about things together. You try to make sense of the world together. You try to help one another deal with the difficulties that the world has sent your way. Right? You complain about stuff in your lives and your exams and your friends, and like that's part of what good relationships are, is you come together and you filter through some of the BS that the world throws our way. Obviously that's not quite the exact same thing in an infant, pre-verbal infant, as it is when you're 18, 19, 20, 25 years old, but the idea is the same. Like, you make the world a better place. You try to help your partner see that everything's going to be okay. And more than that, there's a real positive upside to it, which is, I just learned this really cool thing, or I just found this out, or I just read this book, or let's go see this movie together. Let's have this experience. Let's share these experiences. And this actually gets very close to where we're going to be on Thursday when we talk about different ways that we keep our relationships healthy and strong. Like, what are the things that we do to solidify the bonds? What are the pro-social, the pro-interactional kinds of experiences that we create that allow our relationships to be healthy and strong. We'll talk a lot about that on Thursday. And interestingly enough, some adults, I'm told, engage in baby talk with one another, as do parents with their children, right? And so I was watching one of my videotapes from one of my laboratory sessions, and right when their conversation began, the husband said "woo-foo" to his wife. I looked at my grad student who was watching the monitor, as I was, and I said, "Woo-foo? Is there something wrong with our microphone? Like, what's up with that?" He said, "Oh, no, it's baby talk. They're just saying, 'I love you.' That's how they say 'I love you.'" You may have seen the famous Seinfeld episode. Anybody know the word? The schmoopy episode? Yeah, the schmoopy episode. So that is another classic example of baby talk. So there's a lot of parallels between, or the assumption is, the belief is, that there are many parallels between how attachment works in childhood and the implications that has for how we pursue, enable, create, sustain our relationships in adulthood. Okay? So now we're making this switch to the same idea, but now in a different interactional context. And this is an important idea. You can see the two dimensions that I've already told you about, okay? So you can see the anxiety dimension across the horizon here, right? The x-axis here, right? So anxiety is, remember, self-related. Remember I said that anxiety is the self-related dimension. I said it right there, right? So anxiety is the self-related dimension. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you about the other dimension, the up and down dimension, the vertical, which is about the other dimensions, about avoidance. So what attachment people do is they put these things together. And they say, if all of us have some representation of ourselves and our others inside of us, then we should be able to figure out how those things get related. And there's been a number of studies suggesting that this is a legitimate way to do this organization, to put these two different dimensions of our working models together simultaneously, right? So there is the positive view of the self on the left. That's when you're low in anxiety. And a negative view of the self, which is the sense of inadequacy, or that I'm not good enough, or that I'm a little uncertain about who I am. And the idea is that this is a reflection of where you or your partner was when they were growing up, right? The other dimension, as I've indicated, is the avoidance dimension. This is the other-oriented dimension, okay? So now we're talking not about your working model that relates to you and your understanding of yourself, but your understanding of other people, okay? So you see now that's the avoidance dimension, and that has a low part and a high part, okay? Low avoidance means other people are good, available, I can connect up with them, they provide me good stuff, I can thrive in that kind of environment. But the other side of that dimension is high avoidance, where I think, based on the experiences that I've had, I'm going to pay a price. Like if I get too close here, I'm going to pay a price. I cannot trust other people. People have let me down. People consistently disappoint me, right? I cannot really feel like when I move into a relationship with another person, that person is really going to be available to me and there for me when the going gets tough, okay? So you've got this self-oriented dimension and an other-oriented dimension, okay? And you put those two together, and you don't really get four real specific types, but you get four clusters of how any of us could get organized as we pursue intimate relationships, okay? So, and these are four terms that we use. secure attachment is a big one. In fact, that's the biggest category. 70% of all people, 60 to 70% of all people are probably in that secure category. Okay? But people are also arrayed into these other three categories, one of which is the dismissing style, which is I have a pretty good sense of who I am, and other people don't matter so much. Or I just can't trust them. I can rely on myself way more than I can rely on other people. There's another view which, if you go from secure to preoccupied, is the idea that I have a negative view of myself, but I really think other people have a lot to offer me. So I'm sort of other-oriented, but I also have a real deep need for what they provide for me. And then the other quadrant there is the fearful quadrant. And so this is a negative view of others and a negative view of yourself, right? Another Seinfeld reference here. Some people claim that Jerry is the dismissing one, right? He's pretty confident in himself, and he puts down other people pretty quickly. The fearful one is George, has a negative view of himself and other people. Elaine is the preoccupied one, a little neurotic, but still really needing relationships with other people. And the funny thing, of course, is that Kramer is the sane one. This was the underlying humor is that he's okay with himself and he's okay with other people. So let's take a little bit of a closer look now. I have, if you open up your slides, if you can get these as PowerPoint slides, what I've done is I've hyperlinked these so you can click through. And here, let me just give you an example. I have it for all four quadrants, but let me just give you a flavor of this. Secure individuals, the positive self, positive other category, right? Low in anxiety, low in avoidance, worthy of others' love, confident in the ability that others will be responsive and dependable, comfortable with closeness and intimacy, and while they value relationships, they're also able to maintain their sense of independence and autonomy away from relationships. So now we have to sort of put the two dimensions together and create a sense of who that individual is. And the secure type is sort of the most boring type. Everything's pretty much fine. They relate well to other people relate well to them. They have a good, positive sense of who they are in relationships, but also outside of relationships. And they have an expectation that other people are basically good and can nurture and comfort them. Okay? That's the secure model. And then if you click on this title, it'll take you back. And let's do the George Costanza version. Remember, he was the one whose gym teacher called him "Can't stand ya." Remember that? So here's the George Costanza model. Negative views of themselves and of others leaves them to be high in anxiety, and like the dismissing individuals, they're also prone to avoiding intimacy and closeness. There's an avoidance here. And remember, avoidance and anxiety, two really key words. Anxiety is the self-referent part. Avoidance is the other-referent part. Their quest for intimacy begins with the expectation that they're not worthy of others' caring. That's the negative sense of self and consideration. That pushes them to seek validation from other people. I'm not worthy. I need somebody else to prop me up, right? I need somebody else to help me feel good about myself. At the same time, they struggle with the internalized sense that others are unlikely to provide the affirmation that they need, right? So I have this sense of anxiety about myself, and I turn to you, but oh, damn, I've got this other model that says, oh, you're not so reliable, you're not so trustworthy, you're not really going to be there for me. So this person is sort of caught in this attachment bind. And because others are expected to be a source of pain and rejection, fearful individuals tend to avoid intimacy and the discomfort that it brings. Okay? So you should be able to, once you really parse it out to universal model, individual differences model. Individual differences model has, the anxiety and the avoidance part as a result of the caregiver. You can cross those into a matrix. And then once you sort of feel what that matrix is about, you can say, oh, right, positive, positive, negative, negative, and then the off-diagonal elements as well, right? So, not too hard to work your way through. Psychologically interesting, psychologically rich and compelling. I hope you find it useful. Here's another model that people have alluded to, which is, I don't know if people still read the Peanuts cartoons, but here is the idea that Charlie Brown, negative sense of himself and of other people, Peppermint Patty, a very secure sense of herself, not the smartest character in the history of cartoons, a real tomboy, but loves life, is always out there. I'm not sure Lucy is the best example of a preoccupied person, but Schroeder is sort of totally fine being on his own, just like Jerry Seinfeld, really doesn't need other people to sort of go through the world and feel good about how their life is going to be. So I'm going to end the lecture a little bit early today, but let me just go through one more slide here. Because there is the important idea you might remember from the first part of today's lecture, which is that it might work differently if there's a threat in the environment than if there's not, right? So that part of, even in adulthood, what we're tracking is where we are emotionally, where our caregiver is, and their relationship to us, their availability to us, the extent to which we're predisposed or inclined to avoid them, and then the threats out in the world, right? So we can make sense of these threats, and as these threats go up, we get distressed. And so we signal our needs for comfort and closeness, and secure individuals check out the stress and they manage to cope, right? They have a good sense of themselves, so maybe they can do a lot of coping on their own. That would be using internal resources, or they can turn to others in effective ways. They can actually say, wow, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now. I wonder, there's something I need to talk about. And that's a disclosure, right? That's a powerful experience in relationships, to admit that you're weak or vulnerable. And the idea is that when secure individuals are beyond their own resource level, or they feel like a need to connect up with somebody else, they're quite able to do that. They have a sort of a flexibility here that allows them to say, I can deal with this, not a problem. But when I can't, I'm also capable of reaching out and getting the help of another person. That's a pretty powerful thing to be able to do in a relationship, right? So we often in clinical psychology, we often say that's really a sign of strength, right? To admit that you're weak. There's kind of a built-in paradox there. But different things happen when people score higher on the avoidant dimension or higher on the anxious dimension, right? So now if the avoidant person is in distress, this is the person, remember, avoidance really is me in relation to other people. I defensively deny the need for help from others. That hasn't worked so well for me in the past. So look, I don't need your help. I can take care of this by myself. And they use distancing strategies to cope with distress, right? Not only do I think I might have the capacity to manage this on my own, I'm pretty sure that I don't want to turn to you for support here. Because I have this idea in my head through my history that hasn't worked out so well for me, right? So I'm not going to turn to you. And oftentimes, you see this in therapy a lot, you see this in relationships a lot, you have this vague glimmer of a sense that you are, if you're in a relationship with a person who has some of these tendencies occasionally, I mean, these don't come out in full-blown form all the time, but that the person is treating you not like you, but they're sort of treating you in a way that's more consistent with other relationships that they've been in, right? You say, look, I'm not like that other guy. I'm not like that other person. I'm a little different from that person. And it's like your partner can't figure out that you are reliable, that you are trustworthy, that you are dependable, right? So in a sense, the person is responding on the basis of prior relationships And assuming that that's the expectation, right? That's the working model. And assuming that that will carry over into all subsequent relationships, right? Insecure, anxious people do something different. So now it's the self-relevant emotion, right? So it's now not the avoidance, not that I'm going to turn away from you in a time of distress because you're not available, and because I believe you're not available, because that's what my experiences have been like in the past. Anxious individuals now are going to overuse their self-networks, right? So they don't have a lot of confidence in themselves. So they turn to other people for a lot of support, and they get a lot of support, but they may not feel so much satisfaction with the support that they receive. It's often not enough. Like, I still need more to feel like I'm comforted and I'm soothed and I'm back to my emotional baseline. Okay? So that's it. I will, let me show you this one great picture. Isn't that nice? And I'll stick around for a few minutes if you want to come and talk to me about exam-related stuff.